All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're heading into a pretty fascinating area, where biology and philosophy really intersect.
Yeah, it's a really cool spot to be, especially focusing on the contributions of thinkers in Latin America.
I mean, think of this as a kind of like a philosophical expedition. We're going to see how these individuals, how they've really acted as philosophers
Mhm.
when they're looking at, the science of life.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
We've got a lot of great material to work with,
Oh, absolutely.
mainly from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And our goal here is to really get to the core of how these Latin American thinkers, they haven't just, thought about biology, they've really engaged with it philosophically. And not just the theory, but also the social and historical side of things.
Right, right. It's very much grounded in their context. What's so fascinating about this is how the specific history and social landscape of Latin America has really shaped the kinds of philosophical questions they're asking about biology.
Yeah, for sure.
It's not just, repeating debates from other parts of the world. There's something really unique and valuable here.
Okay, so to keep us on track, our journey today is going to focus on three main areas where this philosophical engagement is really clear. We'll start by unpacking the concept of race.
Okay.
Then we'll dig into how these thinkers have actually analyzed biological theories themselves.
Right.
And finally, we're going to explore that kind of back and forth, that dynamic relationship between philosophy and the history of biology.
Sounds good.
By the end, you should have a really good grasp, a clear understanding of some pretty complex but really crucial ideas.
Absolutely. And as we go through these topics, you'll see how these thinkers, they haven't just accepted what science tells them. They've questioned assumptions, frameworks, the whole picture.
Right.
They've been acting as philosophers in a really direct and impactful way.
Okay, so let's jump into that first area, the problem of race. I mean, this is a topic with a heavy history, especially in Latin America, with all its social hierarchies and racial discrimination.
Yeah.
Our sources point to these early debates even way back in the colonial era.
Right.
Like, we're talking about, Bartolomé de las Casas,
Yes.
Juan Yanez de Sepúlveda, Alonso de la Vera Cruz.
Important figures.
It's just striking how early on that concept of race, even if it wasn't fully formed as we understand it today, it was used to justify, well, certain social orders.
Yeah, and what's really key here is that these early thinkers, they were basically doing philosophy in response to a very real, very urgent social problem.
For sure.
They were grappling with human rights, justifications of power, and they were using, the intellectual tools they had back then. It was natural philosophy, right?
Yep.
To argue for or against a treatment of indigenous populations.
Yeah.
It wasn't just abstract thinking. It had immediate and often really devastating real-world consequences.
Wow. So moving to the more modern era, we see a shift happening, right?
Yeah.
Our sources talk about this move from scientific racism to racial skepticism among Latin American biologists and philosophers. We see names like Sergio G.J. Pana,
Yes.
Carlos López Beltrán, Gustavo Caponi. Can you just break down those terms for us quickly? Scientific racism, racial skepticism?
Sure. So racial naturalism, that's the idea that human races are like solid, real biological categories.
Okay.
Like there are inherent differences, like fundamental differences between them.
Yeah.
And then racial skepticism is like, whoa, hold on.
Push back on that.
Yeah, they're rejecting that. They say, look, there's no strong biological basis for dividing us humans into these separate races. This shift is a huge philosophical move. It's driven by new scientific understanding and also this critical look at how racial classifications have been used in really harmful ways throughout history. So they're really acting as philosophers by questioning the very foundation of this long-held belief.
So it's not just about science.
Right.
It's about the impact of that science, the implications.
Exactly.
And this skepticism leads to the idea of racial constructivism.
Yeah.
Right. Which isn't saying that race isn't real in our lives, but it's more of a social construct, a historical creation.
You're right. It's not coming from biology. It's coming from our social interactions and our history.
Our source mentions different types.
Yeah.
Thin, interactive, and institutional. A lot of nuance there.
There is, but the core idea is that while biology might not back up this idea of, fixed races, the idea of race, it has real social effects. Big ones.
Okay.
So think of thin constructivism as saying, okay, race is basically tied to what we see, those surface physical traits.
Got it.
Interactive constructivism is more about how people categorized into a certain race often share experiences and social realities.
Right.
And then you've got institutional constructivism,
Yeah.
which points to how race is defined and maintained by, the institutions, the power structures in a society. So these are all different ways of looking at how race actually works in the world, but without needing this biological grounding. It's about how we think about race, how we use it, how it impacts people's lives. These thinkers are acting as philosophers by really dissecting this concept, something we might think is simple, but they're showing us how complex it really is.
Gustavo Capone's analysis of the folk concept of race through this physiognomic type idea.
Yes.
That sounds really interesting. He's focusing on those traits that we can actually see.
Right, the surface level stuff like skin color or facial features. Capone's saying that, when people talk about race in everyday life, they're usually referring to these visible differences.
Makes sense.
And he's making this very important distinction. Just because biological races, like scientifically defined ones, don't exist, doesn't mean that these categories based on how we look don't have a real impact. People are treated differently because of their appearance, and that has huge consequences for their lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's not about denying the reality of people's experiences.
Right.
It's about understanding how this concept, this idea of race, is used and misused.
So then this leads to this debate within Latin American philosophy of biology itself, which is really interesting. We see Carlos Lopez Beltran and Sergio DJ Pena. They're advocating for normative racial eliminativism.
Yeah.
That's basically saying we should just stop using the concept of race completely. But Capone takes a different stance, normative racial conservationism. That's kind of surprising given everything we just talked about biological race not being real.
It might seem that way at first. Lopez Beltran and Pena, their argument is that even using racial categories in a social sense, it can accidentally reinforce these outdated and harmful biological ideas.
Got it.
But Capone, while he's totally against racism, he suggests that in very specific situations like forensic anthropology or maybe parts of medicine, and importantly, in dealing with inequalities that already exist, like affirmative action policies in Brazil, for example, he thinks these physiognomic types, these social markers, they might still be useful.
Okay, so there's still a role for them, but it's very specific, and it's always in the context of addressing these real-world inequalities.
Exactly. He sees racial categories, as they exist socially, as something we need to deal with directly through policy and action. And sometimes to do that, you need to acknowledge them, use them strategically.
It's interesting how Pena was actually involved in those Supreme Court hearings on affirmative action in Brazil.
Right. That's a great example of a biologist really stepping into these philosophical and social debates.
Yeah, very cool. So this brings us to a tricky and maybe even sensitive area, mestizo genomics.
Yeah.
Our source talks about how genetic research in Latin America, like these big projects, the Mexican Mestizo Genome Project or Brazil's Homo Brazilis Project, they seem to be, in a way, reintroducing race-like categories through this concept of mestizo,
Right.
which basically means mixed ancestry.
Yeah, it gets complicated here. What's important to remember is that, when scientific research starts dealing with these deeply rooted social and historical ideas, there's bound to be some tension.
For sure.
And the word mestizo, it has a lot of baggage in Latin America. It's often tied up with ideas of national identity, social hierarchy, all those things. And so you have philosophers, along with anthropologists and sociologists, raising some pretty serious concerns.
Okay.
Concerns about using mestizo as if it's some fixed, scientifically meaningful category. And they're also questioning the methods used to analyze and group genetic diversity.
Like how they actually decide what goes where.
Exactly. Andreas Winther's work on diversity partitioning and clustering analysis is a really good example of this.
So these thinkers are essentially acting as philosophers by scrutinizing the very basis of this research. They're not taking it at face value.
Exactly. They're asking, are we sure we're measuring the right things?
Yeah. Are we using the right categories?
And are we interpreting the results in a way that doesn't reinforce old biases, and even if that's not the intention?
So even though these studies are looking at ancestry and genetic variation, the way they group people and use terms like mestizo, it could end up strengthening those old racial ideas, even if the scientists aren't trying to do that.
That's the worry, right? And Winter's work shows how these methods, like partitioning and clustering, They're valuable tools for sure, but how we interpret those results is heavily influenced by the assumptions we start with and the categories we choose.
Right.
So it's easy to end up with interpretations that make race seem like this clear-cut biological thing when the actual genetic data doesn't necessarily support that. The philosophical work here is about looking critically at those assumptions, those interpretations, and saying, are we being careful enough?
Okay, so it's about nuance and being really aware of potential biases. Our source then talks about Pascasio Montito. He's critiquing INMEGEN, Mexico's National Institute of Genomic Medicine, right? He's saying they're using these pre-established non-biological categories like Zapotec to divide populations. And Rodrigo Arroyo Santos raises concerns about these surrogate variables in genetic studies of complex diseases.
Right.
It seems like these philosophers are getting into the nitty-gritty of the scientific methodology itself.
They are, and that's a crucial role for philosophy to play. They're acting as philosophers by questioning those underlying assumptions, the methods being used. Montillo's saying, look, categories based on culture or language, like Zapotec, they might not match up with actual genetic differences, so your conclusions about population structure could be off.
Interesting.
And Arroyo Santos, he's worried that when we study diseases with multiple causes, researchers might see a genetic marker that's more common in a socially defined group and jump to the conclusion that it's causing the disease,
Right.
when it could be something else entirely, like
Oh.
socioeconomic factors or the
Right.
environment. So it's a really important critique of how we build and interpret scientific categories.
So the takeaway here is that we need to be really careful about jumping to conclusions based on genetics.
Exactly.
Especially when it comes to these complex social categories.
Mm.
And lastly, in this section, the source mentions philosophical analysis of genomic medicine in Mexico, with the argument that socioeconomic factors and nutrition might actually be more important than genetics for things like obesity and diabetes. And it contrasts how forensic genetics is used in Argentina, connected to the work of the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, with how it's used in Colombia.
Yeah.
It seems like even the application of genetics in different social contexts is being carefully examined.
It is. The argument about health in Mexico, it's basically saying, look, we can't reduce everything to genes.
Right.
There's this whole web of social factors that play a huge role.
And the Argentina-Colombia comparison, that really highlights how the social and political landscape shapes how science is actually used, what it means in different places.
Exactly. In Argentina, it's been crucial for human rights, reuniting families. In Colombia, it's more tied to these traditional ideas about race and geography. So it's not just about the science itself, it's about how that science interacts with the world.
Right. That was a really deep dive into the problem of race.
It was, yeah.
Now let's shift gears to our second big topic, which is the philosophical analysis of biological theories.
Okay.
Our source reminds us that this connects to those really big questions in philosophy of science about what actually makes a scientific theory, what it's made of.
Right. The fundamentals.
It mentions three main perspectives: classical, historicist, and semantic. So I think we need a little crash course here on these different philosophical lenses.
Okay, yeah. Those are three of the main ways philosophers have tried to, get a grip on the nature and structure of scientific theories.
Okay.
Think of the classical view as seeing theories as these organized systems of statements, almost like a logical framework.
Well-
And then the historicist view, which became popular later on, it emphasizes the historical development of theories and how scientific communities shape those theories.
Okay.
And the semantic view, that one focuses on theories not as sets of statements, but as collections of models that represent the world.
Okay, that makes sense.
So you've got these different ways of approaching theories: logic, history, models.
Okay, so Latin American philosophers, they've engaged with all three of these.
They have, yeah.
They're acting as philosophers by using these frameworks to try to make sense of biological knowledge.
Exactly. They're using these tools to break down biology in different ways.
Our source points out how some really influential thinkers in Argentina, Mario Bunge and Gregorio Klimovsky, they applied that classical view to evolutionary theory.
Right, the big one.
Klimovsky even analyzed Darwin's argument and suggested that maybe, at least in its initial form, evolutionary theory was missing some of those really high-level theoretical statements.
Yeah, that was a bit controversial. Klimovsky, working within that classical view, he was trying to see if Darwin's argument in The Origin of Species could be laid out as a hypothetico-deductive system.
Like a clear set of premises leading to conclusions.
Exactly. And his claim, which not everyone agreed with, was that Darwin's work didn't have those really abstract universal laws that people often associate with mature scientific theories, like in physics, for example.
So he was saying it wasn't quite at that level yet.
In a way, yeah. Bunge, who often worked with others like Mario Monner, he was also working within this hypothetico-deductive framework, but he started incorporating this idea of theories as systems of models, which, like you said, kind of bridges over to that semantic view.
Okay, so he's acknowledging that there's more to it than just these statements and deductions.
Right. It's about how those statements are represented in models in ways that can be tested and refined.
Okay, so then we have Anna Carolina Regner in Brazil. She comes along
Yeah.
and critiques those attempts to fit Darwin into that strict hypothetico-deductive mold.
Right. She pushes back.
She argues that the origin of species is better understood as she puts it, one long argument with a more interconnected, network-like structure.
It's a different way of seeing the logic of Darwin's work. Regner's arguing that the usual ways of reconstructing Darwin's argument, they kind of oversimplify it. They don't capture how all the different pieces of evidence and reasoning are woven together in the origin.
Okay, so it's not just a straight line from A to B.
No, it's more like a web of ideas that all support each other. And she's pointing out that we need to pay attention to the rhetorical side of scientific writing, how it's meant to persuade, not just the pure logic.
So she's adding another layer of complexity.
Exactly. She's acting as a philosopher by challenging that dominant way of analyzing one of the most important texts in biology.
Okay, then the source mentions Pablo Lorenzano and his analysis of medical theories, like Hans Selye's stress theory, from this classical viewpoint.
Right.
He argued that there are actually real theoretical terms within physiopathology, and even that medicine as a science has a certain independence from biology.
That's a really interesting application of philosophy of science to a specific field. Lorenzano is using philosophical analysis to understand the relationship between different sciences. By looking at the logic and concepts of medical theories, he's saying, hold on, medicine isn't just applied biology.
Right, it's got its own thing going on.
It has its own theories, its own body of knowledge. So he's acting as a philosopher by examining these boundaries between disciplines, trying to figure out where one ends and the other begins.
Okay, now let's move on to the historicist view.
Right.
Our source mentions those familiar names, Thomas Kuhn with Paradigm and Exemplars,
Yeah.
and Imre Lakatos with Scientific Research Program.
Right.
It seems like the idea of exemplars from Kuhn, those, like key problem solutions that become models for future research, that's been really useful for analyzing biology in Latin America.
It has. Well, Kuhn's bigger idea of a paradigm as this shared worldview of a scientific community hasn't been used as much in Latin American biology. The idea of exemplars, that's resonated more. It suggests that the practical problem-solving aspects of biology are really important.
Yeah, like when a certain study or technique becomes the standard way of doing things.
Exactly. Those exemplars set the stage for how the field moves forward.
And our source gives us a whole list of examples where Lakatos' framework of scientific research programs, with their hardcore and protective belt of hypotheses and all that, has been used in Latin American biology.
Yeah, it's been applied to the origin of life research, Darwin's natural selection, the Gaia hypothesis, parasitology, genetics. It's a really versatile framework.
So it's a way to analyze how different scientific ideas evolve and compete with each other over time.
Exactly. Lakatos gives you a way to see the historical dynamics of scientific inquiry, how certain ideas become entrenched, how they're defended, how they're challenged. The examples show just how many different areas of biology this framework can be applied to.
So finally, we get to the semantic view, which emphasizes the role of models in scientific theories.
Right.
While our source mentions Patrick Sapes's set theoretical approach applied to phylogenetics and evolutionary theory, it really highlights the structuralist view of theories.
Yeah, the structuralist view has had a huge impact in Latin American philosophy of biology.
Especially in Mexico and Argentina, right?
Especially there, yes. It's all about the formal structure of the models that a theory uses. It's not about how we talk about the theory or its historical context, but about the underlying logic and mathematics.
Okay, so it's a very formal, precise way of looking at things.
It is, and a lot of that work, especially early on, was published in Spanish or German. It's only recently that more of it's becoming accessible to English-speaking audiences.
So these thinkers are acting as philosophers by going deep into the structure of biological knowledge, looking for those underlying patterns.
Exactly. They're trying to reveal the hidden architecture of biological theories.
Our source then talks about the actual methodology of metatheoretical structuralism, identifying the core concepts, their mathematical relationships, the whole theory net structure. It's a very systematic way to dissect a scientific theory, breaking it down to its essential elements.
It is. Structuralism wants to be as precise and explicit as possible when reconstructing the logic of scientific theories.
Like building a blueprint.
Yeah, like a blueprint. You specify the core concepts, the mathematical relationships, how specific laws and models are derived from more general principles.
So you can see how everything fits together.
Exactly. And the theory net concept shows how different levels of a theory connect, how the more abstract general principles relate to the more specific concrete applications.
And this kind of detailed analysis can then be applied to tackle philosophical questions within specific areas of biology. Like, what does adaptation really mean in evolutionary theory? Or what's the status of Mendel's laws in genetics? It's using this very fine-grained tool to zoom in on particular debates within biology.
That's a great way to put it. By clarifying the structure of biological theories, structuralist analyses can offer new insights into these long-running philosophical questions in biology.
Okay, our final big topic is the relationship between philosophy and the history of biology. Our source tells us that this relationship has, well, it's had its ups and downs.
Right. Sometimes close, sometimes distant.
Sometimes they've been seen as really connected, and other times as totally separate disciplines.
It's been a bit of a back and forth.
But the historical turn in philosophy of science was a big moment. It really emphasized how much these two fields rely on each other.
Definitely. The historical turn, which you can see with people like Kuhn and Lakatos, was about recognizing that you can't really do good philosophy of science without understanding how scientific ideas actually change over time.
Right. Like, the history matters.
It matters a lot.
Yeah.
There's that famous quote that gets attributed to both Hansen and Lakatos: philosophy of science without history of science is empty, and history of science without philosophy of science is blind.
Yeah, that sums it up pretty well.
They need each other to really see clearly.
And our source points out that in Latin America, there are all sorts of different approaches to connecting philosophy and the history of biology. You've got synchronic philosophical analysis, which is looking at a theory at a specific point in time.
Okay.
Diachronic analysis, which looks at how ideas evolve over time.
Right.
And conceptual historical analysis, which traces the development of specific concepts. And the important point is that these approaches, they're not mutually exclusive. You can use them together.
Absolutely. Philosophical analysis and historical understanding, they go hand in hand. Even when you're focused on a current theory, knowing its history helps you understand it better. And historians of biology always have some philosophical assumptions they're bringing to their work.
Okay, so it's all interconnected.
It is, and there's a whole range of ways these two fields can work together.
The source gives us some examples. For synchronic analyses, it talks about analyzing evolutionary theory at different points in its development, like using the Lakatosian or structuralist view to look at Darwin's original theory or the modern synthesis.
Right, so you're taking a snapshot of the theory at a particular moment and using a philosophical lens to examine it.
Got it.
It's like saying, okay, how does this theory work at this specific point in time?
And they also mention looking at Mendel's work in light of later developments in genetics.
Yeah, that's a good example. You can see what Mendel got right, but also what was limited by the knowledge of his time.
Okay. And for diachronic philosophical analyses, they talk about using Kuhn's ideas to look at scientific controversies, Lakatos's framework to assess research programs like the origin of life or the Gaia hypothesis,
Yes.
and structuralist analyses of the history of evolutionary biology and genetics. So basically using these philosophical frameworks as tools to understand how science changes over time.
Exactly. These diachronic approaches are all about the dynamics of scientific change.
Right. How do theories emerge? How do they evolve?
How do they compete with other theories?
And how do they sometimes undergo these huge transformations?
The examples from Latin America show the variety of ways you can use philosophy to understand the history of biology.
And then we have those historico-epistemological analyses. They mention Carlos Lopez Beltran using Georges Cangelhem's work to trace the history of the idea of biological heredity.
Right.
Ana Barahona analyzing how evolutionary ideas developed in Mexico. And Gustavo Caponi looking at the adaptationist program in pre-Darwinian natural history.
These approaches really get into how key concepts evolve and the philosophical assumptions that are baked into scientific inquiry. They're not just giving you a timeline of discoveries.
Right.
They're analyzing how the meaning of core concepts changes over time and how that's connected to the bigger intellectual and social context.
And lastly, they mention conceptual historical analyses, things like Regner's analysis of Darwin's argumentation using rhetorical theory. Or Andrade Martin's close examination of Darwin's arguments about domestic pigeons.
This approach is all about those specific arguments, those conceptual strategies that scientists use in their historical context.
Okay, so it's very focused.
Very focused. And by looking closely at the language, the logic, the rhetorical moves, you can uncover these subtle but really important aspects of how scientific ideas were developed and shared.
Wow, we've covered so much ground today. From race and identity to the structure of theories to the whole interplay between philosophy and the history of biology.
It's been a whirlwind tour.
And it's all seen through the lens of these Latin American thinkers who are really actively engaging with these ideas.
Yeah, one of the most striking things is how these thinkers are so willing to connect with the social and historical context of science.
Right, it's not just happening in a vacuum.
Not at all. They're really embodying that idea of acting as philosophers, critically examining the foundations of biology and what it means for society.
And as our source concludes, this field of philosophy of biology in Latin America, it's growing, it's getting more attention. And it's not just an academic thing. It has real implications for science education, for policy decisions, for making sure that science is used responsibly.
Absolutely. It shows that this kind of deep philosophical engagement with science is really important for the world.
So to leave you with something to think about, how does the specific history and social context of a place shape the kinds of philosophical questions we ask about science and the answers we find valuable? What can we learn from that about how we should approach these big biological debates that are happening right now? Food for thought. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.